Hello and welcome to The Rambling Director. Today we're going to be discussing one of my favorite movies of all time, and one of the most innovative films of its era, Jurassic Park. First, let's cover a little film history and learn why this film was so groundbreaking. In 1914, Willis O'Brien created stop-motion animation, and produced for the first time a stop-motion film produced by the Edison Company, which he called The Dinosaur and the Missing Link. Though a few line-drawn cartoons of dinosaurs had been produced, this was the very first realistic cinematic portrayal of the monsters of history. O'Brien later produced his first feature, a film adapted from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, which was a sensation and set a new standard for special effects. He later went on to create all the special effects for King Kong in 1933. His prodigy was Ray Harryhausen, who famously teamed up with O'Brien in 1947 to create all the effects for Mighty Joe Young, which is incredible in how well it holds up today. I mean, just look at this. He created some of the most fluid and beautifully realistic stop motion you will ever see. Though there are times when the characteristic strobing effect of stop motion does show up in his work, it honestly appeared less and less as he grew and perfected his craft. Some of his creatures and some of his scenes look a lot like very photorealistic CGI. Later on, Phil Tippett and Dennis Muren, of course heavily influenced by Harryhausen, worked together to create the incredible effects for the Star Wars trilogy, and won an Academy Award for The Return of the Jedi. Muren went on to work on the Indiana Jones movies, while Tippett went on to create a fantastically innovative film called Prehistoric Beast, which featured apparently handheld shots, something very difficult to create with stop motion, as well as a primitive form of motion blur. For those who don't know, the strobing effect of stop-motion creatures is the main thing that seems off and alerts our brains to the fact that it's an effect. That's because film, being basically rapid photography, is unable to expose and capture a clear image when something is moving. Basically, most frames of a moving object have some level of blur to them. Since the movement is happening between frames rather than in frames with stop motion, lesser animations often suffer from a strobing effect, as I mentioned earlier. For The Empire Strikes Back, Phil Tippett developed a technique called go motion that allowed the tauntauns to move with each opening of the camera's shutter, effectively adding motion blur, which ultimately hides the fact that it is stop motion at all. This effect is why the scene is so convincing that my friend, who had never seen the movie before, turned to me and asked if the tauntauns were one of the CG elements that George Lucas had added. It's just that convincing when it's been finessed with proper time and direction. The process was later perfected with the movie Dragon Slayer, which, as you can see here, is pretty cool in both its look and feel. All of this is important because Jurassic Park spent 2 full years in pre-production before filming actually began. At this point, a lot more of the dinosaurs were going to be animated, but with stop motion rather than CGI. Tippett and Muren were both hired on, Tippett to do the go motion for the project, and Muren to do the optical and digital compositing. But Muren believed that CG could create a more realistic dinosaur for this type of project, and so they created a walk cycle similar to Tippett's stop-motion walk cycle, and showed off how CGI models can be cloned and reused for no additional cost for the herd scenes, where stop and go motion would require each element to be individually created and composited. Spielberg then made the daring and unprecedented decision that every animated shot of the dinosaurs would be created using CGI. Tippett's go-motion storyboards were of course used, and he continued to be the supervisor on the dinosaurs' movements. And since Spielberg decided that all of the stop-motion animators should be programming the movement of the CG dinosaurs, they created an electronic stop-motion armature, which allowed the stop-motion animators to program in the movements of the CG dinosaurs using their own craft. This effectively means that the CG dinos in the finished film were actually a stop-motion CGI creature, not just a computer-programmed one like we use now. But CGI was still a technology in its infancy, and so fewer animated shots made it into the film than were originally planned, meaning that the film relied much more heavily on animatronics, suits, and puppets. All of these techniques obviously have a long and illustrious history in film, just like stop motion, but I think the stop motion being used to create the CG in Jurassic Park is why the CGI holds up so well today. In addition, the limitations it placed on the filmmakers to use fewer animated shots meant that those few precious minutes of CG were given extra time to be finessed, rendered, and re-rendered until they were as close to perfect as possible, and they still look astonishingly beautiful today. So for your consideration and your amusement, I placed Phil Tippett's test footage and the finished film side by side, with some editing to help like scenes match up for comparison purposes. I'll show it through once with no commentary, and then the second time I'll talk a bit about these scenes. Without further ado, here we go.
us if we don't move.
Now, when you look at modern CG, the common complaint is that it doesn't look as good as CG that was done 20 years ago. The common defense is that we're just more used to seeing it, and so our eyes are better trained to suss it out. I think that's true to a certain degree, but when you look at these two shots side by side, it's obvious that one looks real and the other doesn't. The more realistic is obviously the one done 20 years ago, and that's without any context. Side by side, the older CGI looks better. So I don't think it's just about our eyes adjusting and seeing it more. After all, most matte paintings in old movies still fool a lot of people. I mean, just point out to anyone that this shot is entirely a piece of painted artwork except for the little strip of concrete in the middle, and I bet you most people will not believe you. So I think the process really does matter. As previously stated, Phil Tippett programmed every move of these dinosaurs by hand, which added a level of realism to the movements and also gave very fine points of reference for muscle movement. Also, because they had so much to prove, these animators worked incredibly hard to create photorealism in these creatures. Now, I will get some people who disagree with this, but I think that it's important to point out that like with the motion capture used on Robert Patrick in Terminator 2, ILM did a ridiculous amount of light tests and references for each CG shot in Jurassic Park. Today, 1 or 2 reference shots would be taken tops, and then the lighting would be programmed in using presets. Back in 1992 and 93, there were no presets or pre-programmed light filters for CG creatures. Everything was done in the computer from the ground up for every single shot. As you can see, because Phil Tippett programmed the movements as well as doing the stop-motion storyboards himself, the scenes turned out extremely similar in the animals' actions. Also, having a single person in charge of all the dinosaur movements, both practical and animated, gave an incredible continuity between storyboard and film, because Tippett had built a bible of movements and mannerisms for each species to follow. In fact, here's some footage of him showing the actors on set, using his own body, how these dinosaurs are going to move, which is pretty funny to watch. Now, the animators also used Stan Winston's maquettes of the dinosaurs as reference to get the texture of the skin exactly right, much like Peter Jackson did with Gollum using a real-life textured suit to get a sense of how to animate photorealistic skin. In addition, of course, the way the light fell on the raptor suits is also a good frame of reference that was used to create a great deal of depth to the skin of the raptors, like the way the scaly cracks in the skin actually cast minute shadows. Also, compared to the exclusively stop-motion and go-motion, there is such a variety of types of effects that the eye has a harder time keeping track, and thus a harder time seeing how the effect is done and when the suits become CG models. See? Now with the T-Rex scene, we are looking at a considerably shorter portion because much was added to the storyboard. But I will again point out that you can hardly tell when the CG creature is swapped out for the animatronic. Now I've discussed the finished film to death, but it's worth noting that Phil Tippett's models look incredible. In fact, I think it's a shame that when CGI rolled around, We just gave up on the use of stop motion being used as a main effect, because I think combined with CGI, you could remove the shutter and add a more realistic motion blur, and probably create some of the most realistic creatures imaginable. After all, CGI, as many people have said before me, is an illusion of an illusion. You're creating the illusion that something that isn't even there is also moving. But stop motion is only the illusion that a real object is moving. I think combining the two techniques is a fascinatingly brilliant idea in Jurassic Park, and it's such a shame that more animators didn't use it afterwards, because the movement of a lot of CGI creatures has suffered as a result. Something kinda cool that was changed is that the car went from being dragged off to being crushed. I imagine this was to keep the animatronic from having to be moved around too much, or perhaps they just couldn't realistically drag the car in a way that Spielberg was happy with. Also, I'm not sure whether or not Lex and Dr. Grant hanging off the wall was an addition to the scene or if it was originally scripted, but it obviously was not in the storyboards. I also like how we see the T-Rex's tail whip around over the ledge. That's really cute. So that's just a little look at some of the effects in Jurassic Park, and why they work so well. I'll just point out one last little thing that people with a blind animosity towards CGI probably didn't even notice. And I think it helps prove that CGI really was the best option to go with here. There are actually two CG elements in these shots that you probably didn't even notice. The first is that the lawyer here is completely CGI. Also, the car in this shot is completely CGI. It's a testament to how hard these animators worked that you probably didn't even notice that until it was pointed out. Jurassic Park has held up so well over the years, and in my opinion, it's one of the greatest adventure films ever made. I hope this video maybe gave you the experience of seeing parts of the movie differently, or maybe just seeing the test footage that you might have never seen before. Anyway, I hope it blesses some of you who are aspiring filmmakers and maybe helps you see something that you can use in your own projects. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider subscribing, and if you're so inclined, consider donating to my Patreon for extra filmy goodness.